Hollywood did not just manufacture stars. It manufactured masculinity, romance, safety, and the version of private life audiences were allowed to believe. One man married while rumors closed in. One reportedly hid a real partner behind a tragic invented history. One fought in court to protect an image everyone already suspected. And one waited until his 80s to marry the man he loved. Behind the grin, the tuxedo, and the perfect leading man profile, the machine kept secrets. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. Rock Hudson. America saw the dream. Tall, handsome, controlled, and impossibly masculine. In the 1950s and 1960s, Rock Hudson was sold as the safe romantic ideal, the kind of leading man studios could place beside Jane Wyman or Doris Day and trust audiences to swoon. That image mattered because old Hollywood was selling a fantasy of American manhood. Clean, strong, desirable, reassuring. That was the trap. Hudson had been shaped by the studio system under agent Henry Wilson, a star maker who helped build names, bodies, and public stories. In that era, morality clauses, gossip columns, and whispered accusations could wreck a career. A rumor was not just embarrassing. It could cost contracts and the whole carefully polished illusion. Later accounts and multiple biographies have described Hudson's relationships with men, while also describing the pressure to keep those relationships invisible. A long-rumored cover strategy was his 1955 marriage to Henry Wilson's secretary Phyllis Gates, a marriage that ended in divorce in 1958. Gates later insisted she had entered it sincerely, which is exactly why the story still feels so sad. Then everything changed. In 1985, Hudson publicly disclosed that he had AIDS. His death that October did more than shock fans. It forced much of America to stop treating the disease as someone else's story. A man once marketed as ideal heterosexual glamour had become a public face of a crisis the culture had tried to keep at a distance. His story was never just about secrecy. It was about what Hollywood demanded a man erase before it would call him acceptable. Was that deception or survival? Liberace. He did not look like restraint. He looked like spectacle, candelabras, capes, pianos turned into monuments. A grin so wide it almost dared you to ask the obvious question. Liberace built one of the most profitable entertainment brands in America, and that made his image commercially priceless. He was flamboyant enough to be unforgettable, but his public story still had to stop short of open truth. And Hollywood knew it. Mid-century fame ran on a strange bargain. Audiences could notice things. Columnists could hint. Jokes could float through the culture. But a star still might have to deny what many already suspected, because legal risk, social stigma, and career damage were always waiting. In 1959, Liberace won a British libel case against the Daily Mirror after a column strongly implied he was gay. He denied it in court and received damages, later delivering the famous line that he cried all the way to the bank. The victory protected his image, but it also revealed the brutality of the era. Even for a man that visible, speaking plainly could still be dangerous. That was the irony. Later accounts, biographies, and court records connected Liberace to male partners, most famously Scott Thorson, who sued him in the 1980s. Liberace denied that relationship too. He remained publicly evasive until his death in 1987, when his physician said he died from complications of AIDS, a statement that shattered years of denial. His chapter is not shocking because people guessed. It is shocking because guessing was allowed, but honesty was still treated as intolerable. He was one of the most visible men in American entertainment, yet the truth around his private life still had to arrive through lawsuits, illness, and aftermath, rather than freedom. Raymond Burr. He projected authority. For many viewers, he was not just an actor, he was certainty itself. As Perry Mason and later Ironside, Burr represented intelligence, stability, and adult control. That image mattered on television because TV entered the home. It sold trust. It sold reassurance. It sold a man who looked as if nothing messy or forbidden could possibly touch him. But silence can be its own performance. For years, Burr gave interviews that painted a tragic personal history, including stories about a wife and son who had supposedly died. Biographers and later reporting challenged those claims, and some details remain debated, but the broad pattern is hard to miss. Burr appeared to build a safer emotional narrative around loss while diverting attention from his real private life. Meanwhile, Robert Benavides entered that private life in 1960, and the two remained partners for more than 3 decades, also sharing business ventures, including an orchid enterprise and vineyard work. Think about how sad that is. A long, committed relationship existed. Yet the public mythology around Burr often left more room for an invented heterosexual tragedy than for the man who was actually beside him. That is what survival looked like in a culture obsessed with acceptable masculinity. Control the interview, control the rumor, control the label before the label destroys you. Burr never publicly turned his love story into a headline. He stayed guarded and careful to the end. Benavides later spoke more openly, and Burr left his estate to him, making visible in death what had been minimized in life. His story was not simply about a hidden partner. It was about how an industry could make fiction feel safer than truth, even when truth lasted 33 years. If one interview could protect your career, would you have told the whole truth? Jim Nabors. His public image was almost disarmingly gentle. To millions, he was Gomer Pyle, the sweet, innocent, slightly bewildered face of sitcom warmth. That softness mattered because television loved figures who felt harmless, familiar, and safe enough for the whole family. Nabors was not sold as dangerous desire. He was sold as comfort, which made gossip even crueler. Because he was a lifelong bachelor and a close friend of Rock Hudson, industry whispers followed him for years. Nabors did not build a flamboyant persona, stage a legal war, or turn himself into a coded public joke. He mostly did something quieter. He stepped back. He kept distance between his private world and the culture that wanted explanations. That choice can look evasive from the outside. It can also look deeply human when you remember the period he lived through. Silence had a price, but so did exposure. Nabors moved to Hawaii in the 1970s and lived there for decades. He stayed beloved, kept working, and protected his private life with remarkable consistency. Then, in 2013, at age 82, he married his partner of 38 years, Stan Cadwallader, in Seattle, after same-sex marriage became legal there. By then, the revelation did not land like a scandal. It landed like release, like time finally loosening its grip. That is what makes his story so moving. There was no big courtroom collapse, no flashy confession, no revenge interview, just a man who seems to have understood how unforgiving the culture could be, and who waited long enough to reach a different world. His chapter reminds you that not every hidden life was dramatic on the surface. Some were defined by patience, loyalty, and the ache of how late freedom arrived. Paul Lynde. Before he said a word, audiences often felt the joke coming. The raised eyebrow, the sharp pause, the line delivered like a paper cut. On Hollywood squares, on Bewitched, and across variety television, Paul Lynde became a master of comic timing and acid sweetness. His public image was mischievous, witty, and gloriously theatrical. And that image mattered because television needed him to be outrageous enough to energize the room, but not so direct that the room had to confront what it was seeing. That was the bargain. For many viewers, Lynde's persona was coded visibility. People laughed with him, around him, and sometimes at the open secret they were never asked to name. Later biographical accounts describe his sexuality as widely understood in the business, even while the culture still punished openness. That left Lynde in a cruel middle space. Recognizable but not affirmed. Famous but not fully safe. He could be camp, he could be catty, he could be different. But public acceptance still came with conditions. And conditions can turn into loneliness. Accounts of Lynde's life also describe heavy drinking, professional frustrations, and a private sadness beneath the comic surface. He was beloved, yet boxed in by the very style that made him unforgettable. Audiences rewarded the performance, while the industry remained wary of the person. Humor became both shield and prison. Would you call that freedom? What makes Lynde heartbreaking is not that people missed the signal. It is that so many understood it and still preferred the wink to the truth. The machine could monetize coded energy all day long as it did not have to grant dignity to the man creating it. His story was about more than one-liners. It was about the emotional cost of being visible enough to be understood, but never safe enough to be fully known. Rudolph Valentino. Long before television sold wholesome masculinity, Valentino sold something older and more dangerous. Male beauty that looked too sensual, too elegant, too desired. In the silent era, he became one of cinema's first great heartthrobs through films like The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse and The Sheik. Audiences saw glamour, seduction, and mystery. But for parts of the culture, that image also triggered anxiety. He did not fit the blunt American ideal of rough, unquestioned manhood. So the policing began. Valentino's story has often been pulled into later arguments about sexuality, but the evidence there remains unclear, and his chapter is better understood as a story about masculinity under attack. The press mocked his style, his grooming, his grace, and even his popularity with women. He was derided in famously gendered terms, including the nickname Pink Powder Puff, and became a target in a broader panic over what kind of man Hollywood was teaching the public to admire. That matters, because you do not need confirmed same-sex affairs to see the machinery at work. The punishment came from suspicion itself, from the idea that a man who moved differently, dressed differently, or inspired desire in the wrong way could be treated as suspect. In that sense, Valentino stands at the beginning of a long Hollywood pattern. Punish the man who bends masculinity, then profit from the fascination he creates. He died in 1926 at just 31, and the myth only grew larger after that. Underneath the myth was a warning. Even at the dawn of stardom, Hollywood and the media were already teaching male stars that beauty had to be carefully managed and defended. His story is less about a hidden affair than a public panic. The system was already deciding which men were allowed to look desirable and which men had to be mocked for it. Merv Griffin. He did not need to play the romantic lead. He built the room itself. As a singer, talk show host, producer, and the creator of Jeopardy! And Wheel of Fortune, Griffin became a symbol of Polish control and television intelligence. His public image was smooth success, a man in command, a businessman who understood presentation so well that he could turn format into empire. And maybe that was his greatest defense. By the time Griffin reached peak power, Hollywood had changed in some ways and stayed frozen in others. Public image still mattered, especially for a host whose brand depended on broad comfort and executive authority. Rumors around Griffin's private life followed him for years. He rarely offered the public enough to settle them. Instead, he used charm, ambiguity, and polished deflection. In a 2005 New York Times interview, he joked that he was quarter-sexual, a line that revealed almost nothing while keeping control of the exchange. That kind of vagueness was not accidental. It was strategy. Griffin had been married to Julianne Wright and had a son, and he guarded both his business life and personal life closely. After his death in 2007, arguments flared again over what should or should not be said about his sexuality. Some reports were blunt. Friends and associates pushed back on others. The result was fitting in a strange way. Even in death, certainty stayed slippery. That is why his chapter belongs here. Some stars were cornered into denials, some were exposed by illness, some found freedom late. Griffin mastered another route entirely. He understood that power sometimes comes from never giving the audience enough to confirm or deny. Silence, in his case, was not passive. It was managerial. It was crafted. It was part of the brand. His story leaves you with an uncomfortable thought. When Hollywood could not fully erase the person, sometimes it simply taught him to become his own publicist. These stories were never just about hidden desire. They were about a business that sold fantasy and punished honesty. So what do you think? Were these men deceiving the public, or simply surviving the world they lived in? Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and hit the bell for more untold stories.